One of my favorite lines I think you used in that TED Talk was that memory, like liberty, is a fragile thing. Welcome to Injustice for All, and this is episode 4. And today we're going to be joined by a favorite of mine, the leading memory expert in the United States, Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. And she is going to give you a perspective about what can be relied upon from the witness stand because of the way people's memories are manipulated. And as you may recall in prior episodes, I discussed how prosecutors, agents, manipulate witnesses, and not simply in the criminal justice field, but in the civil area as well. People's memories are manipulated when they take the witness stand. As I've also mentioned, I am a great fan of the original Perry Mason series that took place in the early 1950s up until the 1960s. And I watch it almost every day. And what strikes me so much about what occurs in the courtroom in the Perry Mason episodes is that in every case, Perry solves the crime in the courtroom. People stand up from the gallery or on the witness stand and they say, I did it. I committed the murder. And this is preceded in almost every instance by Perry saying to them, you know you're under oath. And it shows you the mindset that we often have in the way we were brought up about the system, that when you put your hand on the Bible and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, that somehow we do tell the truth. But that's not so. And when Perry confronts these people and says to them, you know you're under oath, and then they admit to murder. They'd rather admit to murder than face the potential of being accused of perjury. It's bizarre, but it works in the series, but not in real life. And I can tell you from being around this system for 51 years that the Bible really has no impact on almost anyone. To use an extreme example, I was representing someone in a estate case. The father had died, the sister and the brother were fighting over who got what assets, and the other side called a nun to testify. And the nun got on the stand and she lied, no doubt about it. And then I cross-examined her and I proved that she lied. So if you can't rely upon a nun to put her hand on the Bible and tell the truth, who can you rely upon to be telling the truth? People tell their truth, but not necessarily the truth. A big distinction. And this has been true throughout my career. When I was a prosecutor, the first case I ever worked on, Carlos Pino, there was a cop by the name of Fred Short. And we were preparing Mr. Short, Officer Short, for his testimony, and the prosecutor said to him, so tell me about what you did when this happened. And Fred responded, what do you want me to say happened? And that was my first introduction to how law enforcement officers, agents, are manipulated. And that continued throughout the time I was at the district attorney's office. And when I was with the Office of the Special Prosecutor in New York, that type of conduct occurs. We're being joined this morning by Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a distinguished professor at the University of California at Irvine, well known for her research on the area of human memory, particularly false memories. She's been honored by the APA's Review of General Psychology as one of the 100 most eminent psychologists of the 20th century. Welcome, Dr. Loftus. And let me just say, Elizabeth, that as I've read more about your activities over the last 10 years, I see that your experiments have revealed how memories can be changed by things we are told, facts, ideas, suggestions, and other post-event information, and how that modifies our memories. So perhaps you can give everybody an introduction into what you do, why you do it, what initially caused you to think of this area, and we'll start to learn together.
Oh, sure. Well, taking you back to, say, the 1970s, when I really started doing research on eyewitness memory, people's memories for crimes and accidents and other legally important events, I started showing people simulated crimes and accidents and then questioning them about their experiences. And one of the things I discovered is that when witnesses in my laboratory experiments, but also in the real world, are exposed to some new information, some misinformation after some event is over, it can contaminate their memory. So if you show somebody an accident where a car goes through an intersection with a yield sign and you suggest to them later that it was a stop sign, many people will then say, I remember seeing a stop sign, not a yield sign. So they've succumbed to the suggestion in the misinformation and adopted it as their own memory. And this phenomenon became known in the psychological literature as the misinformation effect. If you expose people to misinformation, it can transform or contaminate or distort their prior memory. So that's how I got started.
I recall an episode that you discuss about an individual named Steve Titus. Tell us about Mr. Titus.
So, well, Steve Titus, that was an interesting and sad situation. Titus was a restaurant manager in the Seattle, Washington area. He was engaged to be married. He had a happy life until one day he found himself being accused of having committed a rape. And it was kind of a sad situation because the victim actually had been raped by a stranger and would eventually look at some photographs and point to the photograph of Steve Titus and say, this one looks the closest. But by the time she got to trial, she was absolutely certain it was Steve Titus. She was positive. She testified in the trial, and he was convicted. And he was just mortified. And what do you do at this point? And he managed to get the attention of a journalist who dug into this story, became convinced that Titus was innocent, and actually found the real rapist, somebody who raped many other people in the area. So Titus was freed from jail, but his life was pretty miserable. He lost his job, he lost his fiance, and he decided to sue the people that he felt were responsible for this wrongful prosecution and conviction. And he died maybe a week before he was to go to court. He died, he was 35 years old, and he died of a stress-related heart attack. So it's just a very sad case that shows you a lot of things about the system. I mean, that somebody, the actual victim's memory could go from somewhat tentative and not very confident to now I'm positive. How damaging a wrongful conviction and prosecution is to an innocent person. eventually the civil jury did award money. He had passed away, but those funds, I'm told, went to his son. So I just mentioned that case because it's just a particularly sad one.
So over the course of time, you've done many experiments in this area. Is that correct?
Oh, hundreds and hundreds of experiments. Yeah, I'm an experimental psychologist, so that's our bread and butter.
So tell us what they demonstrate so that the listeners can understand this is not an isolated episode with Steve Titus.
Well, in the example that I talked about earlier, many of these experiments involve showing people a simulated crime or a simulated accident and questioning them about their experiences. And so in some of my studies, we've shown a simulated accident, for example, and gotten people to later on be exposed to misinformation and then misremember the traffic, the sign that controlled the traffic at the intersection. Or we could convince somebody that the perpetrator was wearing a brown jacket when it was really a green jacket. It was very easy by just telling people, other witnesses said this is the way it was. What do you think? That's just one way that people can get misinformation about something they have experienced. So I and many other psychologists have done experiments demonstrating the power of misinformation to contaminate memory. But I will say that after doing that for a couple of decades, we wanted to see just how far you could go with people. Could you not just change a detail in somebody's memory, but could you plant an entire memory for something that didn't happen? And so some of our more current experiments involve plying people with suggestion and getting them to develop entire memories for things that never happened to them.
Such as what?
Our initial one was we planted a false memory that when you were 5 or 6 years old, you were lost in a shopping mall, you were frightened, you were crying, you were ultimately rescued by an elderly person reunited with their family. And we showed, using a fairly strong form of suggestion, that we could contaminate the memories of about a quarter of our subjects with just a few suggestive interviews. So if you were my subject, can I call you Robert?
You certainly can.
Oh, okay. So Robert, if you were my research subject, I would say, Robert, we've had a conversation with your mother, your father, your older sibling, and we found out that some things happened to you when you were about 5 or 6 years old. And we would have actually worked with your relative to develop some true memories, things that did happen to little Robert when he was 5 or 6 years old. And then with the relative, we would construct a made-up experience about your being lost in a shopping mall in a particular place with particular family members present when you were about 5 or 6 years old. And if you didn't grow up near shopping malls, then we'd have you be lost in a Sears department store or some other big public place. Then we would ask you to try to remember these experiences if you could. We'd ask you several times to do that. And after a few weeks of this suggestive interviewing with the help of your relative, well, if you were one of these subjects who were persuaded, you would start to remember this made-up experience, completely made up with the help of your relative. So that was the first study. And after I started speaking about this work at scientific meetings and then publishing the research, critics came along and said, well, wait a minute, getting lost is really common. Show us you can plant something that would be more bizarre or upsetting or traumatic if it had actually happened. And so other investigators jumped in, and we too, and created other kinds of false memories. You were attacked by a vicious animal as a child. You nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. You witnessed somebody being demonically possessed as a child. And so all of these other things that would have been even more traumatic had they actually happened have been planted in the minds of otherwise healthy human adults.
I recall that there was an example of people going in to see a therapist with anxiety or some eating disorder problem, and the psychiatrist would suggest, well, I've seen people like you with this problem, and it's usually because they were sexually abused as a child. And then that became the memory of the person who came in for treatment. Is that fair to say?
Well, in fact, it was those kinds of cases that actually motivated this work on what we now call rich false memories. Because what we began to see in the 90s was, hundreds, thousands of people going into therapy, just as you said, with one kind of problem. They were depressed, or they were anxious, or they had an eating disorder. And they would come out of this psychotherapy with a different problem, namely that they thought they had recovered massively repressed traumatic memories of horrific abuse that the therapeutic process had uncovered for them. And they were claiming that they had repressed these memories, sometimes for 10 years of rapes and satanic ritual abuse, uncorroborated. And yet many people now began to sue their parents or other relatives or others in their childhood for this alleged abuse. And so now we've got thousands of these cases filling up our courtrooms all over this country and other parts of the world. And so in some ways, that phenomenon inspired some of this work, because some of the techniques that we have used in our experimental work, like guided imagination or sexualized dream interpretation, or some of the other things that these therapists were doing to lead these patients to develop what they thought were recovered repressed memories, were the very techniques that could lead our research witnesses, subjects, to develop these rich false memories.
I recall, and it may be not known to many of the current listeners, but there was a famous case called the McMartin prosecution. And I know you participated in that. Can you tell us about that?
Well, sure. Now, okay, so McMartin, we sometimes is a case involving young children who were still young children. So this was a case involving basically a preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, run by the McMartins, and these little kids were led to believe that all kinds of horrific things had happened to them at this preschool. Many adults were accused, arrested, put on trial. In fact, there were 2 trials, and they were very expensive cases in the state of California, amongst the most expensive criminal prosecutions ever in the state of California. No convictions, but lots of lives destroyed. And many of these little kids, 3, 4, 5, however old they were, led to believe that they were taken away in airplanes and dragged through tunnels and all kinds of other bizarre things happening to them, uncorroborated. And I would say, in my opinion, almost certainly created by many of the people who spoke to these children, including the so-called professionals. And what this McMartin case then spawned, and is little mini McMartins all around the country. So you saw these daycare type cases in New Jersey, in Minnesota, in San Diego, in North Carolina, where lots and lots of people were accused. And many of these convictions have now been overturned, but not before a lot of lives were destroyed.
So, a person who takes a witness stand and has been given suggestions, they believe they're telling the truth. Yes?
And what I study is people who come to believe that something is true when it isn't. And when somebody tells you something that it isn't true, obviously they could be deliberately lying. But what my work is about is a different process. They've actually come to believe it's true. And so we know that sometimes people deliberately lie. And there are some very fine psychologists who study deliberate deception and will tell you that probably an average person may lie, 4 or 5 times a day if you count all the white lies that we tell ourselves and other people. But what I'm talking about here is people who come to believe that this is true and are not deliberately lying. And I do think that when I am involved in court cases, often as a witness for the defense in court cases, it's because a defense attorney thinks that the prosecution witness is saying something wrong, inaccurate, but would rather not call them a big fat liar and can say, look, we're not accusing you of lying, but maybe you've come to believe this for some other reason, and we're saying it's not true.
Right. As you were talking about dream sequence a few minutes ago, what does that mean?
Okay, so one of the things that I saw happening in this questionable therapy, one of the major things that was going on is something called guided imagination. The patient comes in with a couple of symptoms. The therapist says, 80% of people I've seen were sexually abused as a child who have your symptoms. Maybe something like that happened to you. And even though the patient says, no, that never happened to me, the therapist will sometimes say, well, why don't you just close your eyes and try to imagine who might have done this to you? How old might you have been? Where might it have happened? Well, this guided imagination activity, we now know, can lead to the creation of false memories. So that's one of the key procedures that we worry about that's a little bit questionable. But another one is dream interpretation. So let me just say that what do we know about dreams? We know that what you're worrying about during the day can sometimes enter your dreams as dream material. So if you want to talk to a therapist about what you dreamt last night or the other night, maybe it's a starting point for a conversation about what might be bothering you. But what was going on in some of this questionable therapy is that the therapists were taking the dream material and interpreting it as a sign that the patient had been sexually abused. And so I worked on one case where the patient dreamt about a snake, and the therapist said that's a penis. Another case where the patient dreamt about a serpent, and the therapist said that was a penis. But I actually testified in a court case in the state of Washington where I used to teach, where the patient dreamt about a cinnamon roll, and the therapist said that's a penis. And I looked at this transcript, and I'm thinking to myself, what is going on? Why did this therapist decide that the patient's dream about a cinnamon roll meant a penis? And that's what's so great about cross-examination. You can find out from the therapist, why did you say that? And the therapist reported that the reason she decided it was a penis is because the cinnamon roll has that goo on it. And that was the connection for the therapist. So that's what I mean by sexualized dream interpretation. And we have now done studies that show that when an authority figure, a clinician, tells a person that their dream material means that something happened to them in childhood, many people will start to invent a childhood experience to oblige this suggestion.
Well, you even mentioned an example of a woman who came out of therapy believing that she had been in a satanic cult. How did that happen?
There were lots of those cases, particularly in the 90s, where people came out of therapy believing that they had been forced into satanic cults, that their father was a cult leader, that they'd been forced to kill animals, to breed babies, to kill babies. And this happened through the suggestive intervention of therapists who believed in the idea of satanic cults and that satanic abuse was widespread.
So how do we prevent this?
Well, one thing I think is to become aware of the power of suggestion to create and manufacture memories so that we can get people to be careful. Many therapists will say, well, I don't do anything like that. But in fact, sometimes they do, and they're not even aware that they're doing it. I think to educate therapists about this problem, to train them to not just have a sex abuse agenda as an explanation for every problem they see, to realize that there are all kinds of things that can cause depression and anxiety and an eating disorder, besides the idea that you were sexually abused as a child, and to explore other possible explanations for a patient's problems and symptoms. What turned things around a little bit, I think, is that a different kind of litigation. What we began to see, and also later in the 1990s, is some of these patients who'd been drawn into this therapy and led to develop false memories and to accuse their family members. They began to realize their memories were false, and then they sued their therapists for planting false memories, medical malpractice, basically. And there were lots of multi-million-dollar judgments, settlements, or verdicts that were achieved based on this claim of these patients who realized that their memories are false. Now, I remember at the time I was trying to look into those retractors and, what causes somebody to turn around and decide their memories were false. Well, I'll tell you one thing that was happening is their health insurance ran out. So they no longer could pay for the therapy, and now they're separated from this questionable therapy, and they start to realize something was really wrong.
Right. The witnesses aren't lying. They think they're telling the truth, right?
Oh, well, some of them could be lying, for all we know. Some of them could be lying to jump on a bandwagon and
that's fair. That's fair.
Get a financial settlement in a subsequent civil case. But many of them might not be lying. And the ones that we study in our studies, where we distort people's memories for how aggressive or inappropriate somebody's behavior was, they're not lying.
They believe that is their memory.
Right. And that's why they can, express it with a lot of confidence and detail and even emotion, even if it didn't happen that way.
Well, when we initially met in the 1990s, I was representing a police officer who had allowed someone he had detained to be held in a cell but had not removed the person's shoelaces. The person in the cell hung himself, and the police officer was accused of misconduct for allowing the person to keep the shoelaces and for lying about how that hanging occurred. When the incident happened, the police officers saw the person hanging off of the bars in front of the cell, and the person had wrapped a shoelace around his neck and tied it to the cell. His superiors who came told him he had to be lying, that the person had to have hung himself off of the ceiling and that the cop was covering up. They said this to him repeatedly. And when he appeared before a grand jury to testify, he told them that the guy had hung himself from the ceiling. He was charged and ultimately acquitted, primarily because of your work, showing that the superiors had planted a false memory that he had adopted. So I'm more than familiar with how important your work is. But why don't prosecutors get this?
Well, first of all, what you're describing is, I guess, a typical, maybe not so typical because it's very specific, but case where there's lots and lots of suggestion it being thrown at a person, and it changes their memory. And so that certainly is no surprise to me or to the many, many hundreds or more thousands of cognitive and social psychologists who work on the problem of the malleability of memory. Why don't prosecutors get it? Well, first of all, lots of people in my field do spend time interacting with police agencies, trying to help police agencies develop methods of interviewing witnesses or suspects to get more accurate and complete information and to avoid the misinformation problem. And there have been lots of changes in law enforcement, at least around this country, and how they do things as a result of this interaction with the scientists and others. So not every agency, not every police officer, not every prosecutor is going to appreciate that, but at least there's been some influence of this scientific work on law enforcement practices and policies.
Well, I know that we're talking about the tip of the problem, and that this exists in far more reaching areas that we're discussing today. I mean, you can suggest foods to a person and tell them that they're allergic to them, and they believe that if you repeat it often enough, or a particular type of liquor. Correct, right?
Well, what we did in those food studies is to plant a false memory that you got sick as a child eating a particular food, eating eggs or eating pickles or eating strawberry ice cream or eating eggs, and people don't want to eat these foods as much anymore. You plant a false memory that you got sick on a vodka drink, and they're not as interested in having a vodka drink. So what we show is that false memories can have repercussions. They can affect your later intentions or your thoughts or your behavior. That was the basic idea in all of those food studies, look at the repercussions of a false memory.
So at bottom, someone could say something with confidence, detail, emotion, mean it, but it's not factual.
Exactly. And when I gave a TED talk 10 years ago or so at TED Global in Scotland, and I wanted to end with a take-home message, that was exactly my message. Just because somebody tells you something and they say it with a lot of detail and confidence and they cry when they tell you it doesn't mean it actually happened, because false memories can have those same characteristics.
One of my favorite lines I think you use in that TED Talk was that memory, like liberty, is a fragile thing.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite lines too, and that's partly connects to the idea that one of the major causes for wrongful convictions. You take the Innocence Project database, hundreds and hundreds of wrongful convictions, people who were later proven to be innocent because of DNA testing, and investigate those cases. What's the major cause of wrongful convictions? And the major cause was faulty human memory. And so that's what led to this idea of memory like liberty in the case of those innocently convicted people. It's fragile.
And that's why eyewitness testimony is among the least reliable forms of evidence.
Well, it's got its problems, but we're probably going to have to learn to live with it and try to learn to recognize that some eyewitness testimony is more reliable than other eyewitness testimony, and see if we can't help people figure out which is which.
It's a problem that permeates the system. But fortunately, we have people like you who make us aware of how to address it.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Elizabeth Loftus, thank you so much for appearing today. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to speak again.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you. Nice talking with you.
Nice speaking to you. I hope you all enjoyed Dr. Loftus. She's a wonderful, important person to understand and to have part of the system. This is episode 4 of Injustice for All. We'll see you here next week as we explore more of the flaws and potential ways we can improve the system.